So welcome to the Institute of Historical Research seminar series, World in a Historic House. I'm pleased to represent the University of the West Indies as convener of this particular seminar. We are convening this session from the Caribbean, one of the formative spaces of colonial contact and exploitation, including encounters of slavery and indentureship, the entire colonial experience. And it is strange that in 2021, many of our heritage spaces in the region are only now waking up or awakening to representing this history. We want to make connections through this seminar so that places that initiated this relationship understand the challenges of representing this heritage, especially for local audiences. So I invited three speakers today to share their experiences from across the Caribbean. And I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Grace Turner, Dr. Reg Murphy, and John Angus Martin, all who will share their experiences of representing these so-called hidden histories, research, representation, and reinterpretation of Caribbean historic sites. So although many of our researchers are very familiar with this history, I think they're also going to share with you the experience that our local audiences in the Caribbean are not necessarily seeing this history represented on the landscape. So they've taken their academic research, and now how do we let this become part of the narratives that are shared with the public? And because the Caribbean is such an intensive space for tourism development, that also means that our audiences are quite diverse in that way. So we have a local audience, but we also have a visitor audience, and that has created some tensions in terms of reinterpretation or interpretation. So I hope they're going to share some of those challenges with you today. So I'm very pleased to welcome, let me just pull up the email, right. Dr. Grace Turner, who was awarded her doctorate degree in anthropology, specialization in historical archaeology from the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia in 2013. Her PhD research was on the St. Matthew's Northern Burial Ground, East Bay Street in the Bahamas, and is now the subject of her book, Honoring Ancestors in Sacred Space, the Archaeology of an 18th Century African Bahamian Cemetery. Dr. Turner has worked as a Ministry of Education, History, Social Studies, and Geography teacher, and at the Bahamas Department of Archives, where she worked in the museum and archaeology section. She is currently Senior Archaeologist and Research Officer with the Antiquities, Monuments, and Museum Corporation in Nassau, the Bahamas, and is Adjunct Professor of History at the University of the Bahamas. So welcome, Dr. Turner. Dr. Reg Murphy is the Secretary General for the National Commission of UNESCO of Antigua and Barbuda. He is also an affiliated professor of the City University of New York Graduate Center and the president of the Historical and Archaeological Society of Antigua and Barbuda. For the past 15 years, he worked as the manager of heritage resources for the National Parks of Antigua, and he was a past president of the International Association for Caribbean Archaeology, but continues to serve as a board member. Dr. Murphy also served as a trustee of the Clarence House Restoration Trust, that was dedicated to the restoration of the 18th century British naval commander's house in English Harbor, and as a chairman of the Betty's Hope Estate project that successfully restored a 17th century windmill to working condition. I could really go on and on about Dr. Murphy's achievements, but I think his crowning achievement in the last number of years has been the successful nomination of Antigua's Naval Dockyard to the UNESCO World Heritage List. So I congratulate Dr. Murphy, but also use this opportunity to welcome him to the panel. Now I want to also introduce John Angus Martin, who's an historian, archivist, and researcher who currently lives in the Dutch Caribbean, in the island, a very small island very close to St. Martin, called Saba, and he is the director of the Saba Archaeological Center. He is also affiliated as a fellow of Carib Trails under the Dr. Corinne Hoffman Kitliv in Leiden, the Netherlands. He has a multidisciplinary academic background and diverse experiences. He specializes in the history of colonialism and slavery in Grenada, but explores Caribbean identity and historical relationships in archipelagic spaces. He is currently pursuing a PhD in heritage management in the Faculty of Archaeology at Leiden, and he's looking at landscape history, representation, memory, and identity in Grenada. So he has this very special combination of having an experience working and living and working in a island like Grenada, which is now an independent island. And then he also has the experience of working in a Caribbean dependency, such as Saba. So I'm really looking forward to hearing some of his perspectives on sharing this history and heritage. So I'm going to let Dr. Turner start. So if you want to just share your screen, that would be great. Grace, you can take it away.
Thank you. And it's definitely a pleasure to be here. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. So in the Bahamas, the legislation for managing cultural heritage is the Antiquities, Monuments and Museums Act. This act was passed in 1998 and it was amended in 2011. At that point, it was particularly amended with regard to underwater cultural heritage. The whole purpose of the act is to deal with historic preservation, archaeology, and it established a national museum. So next screen. Okay, so in terms of historic preservation, in certain areas of the Bahamas, that comes fairly easily. These are images from Harbor Island in the Bahamas. Harbor Island is a tiny key off the northeast coast of Eleuthera Island. It would have been one of the earliest communities established by early British settlers in the mid-1600s. But for all of the Bahamas, over 90% of our historic structures only date to the late 18th century, because in the late 17th and early 18th century, the Bahamas became a pirate haven, and the settlements were constantly being burnt by the Spanish and the French. So that has a definite impact on what built heritage remains today. After the American Revolutionary War ended in 1783, there were a number of people who wanted to remain with the British Crown. Some of them had moved to Florida, but at the end of that war, Great Britain traded Florida for the Bahamas. And so several thousand loyalists, along with their slaves and a number of free persons of color, migrated to the Bahamas. And in a community like Harbor Island, the structures that we look at would all date to that late 17, early 1800s period. Today, this community is pretty much supported by wealthy second home visitors who are easily able to restore and maintain these structures. And a couple of years ago, the OAS had a program, the COHERIT program, where they were encouraging islands in the Caribbean to develop a listing of historic resources. And they were using the Harbor Island community in the Bahamas as a pilot study for this. So that aspect of historic preservation is pretty easy in the Bahamas. And also when you deal with downtown Nassau. So the Balcony House in downtown Nassau became an historic house museum in 1992 with the quincentennial celebrations. The Central Bank of the Bahamas, which is across the street from this house, purchased the house, paid for all of the restoration, but the museum section of the Department of Archives and now the Antiquities Corporation, that is the management agency for this historic house. In continuing to conduct the research on the house, which dates to the late 1700s, it was discovered that in the later 1800s, one of the more prominent Black Bahamian families owned this house. The original ancestor of that family, the Delet family, came to the Bahamas as a child in the very early 1800s from the former French colony of Saint-Domingue, which became Haiti. And in 1830, by the time free people of color were able to vote and were elected to the House of Assembly, Stephen Delet was one of the 4 first people of color elected to the House of Assembly. And it's his son and grandchildren who were owners of this house at one point. And its last owner was also a wealthy American who restored the house to the early 20th century period. But in the history of the house, it's recognized that it has gone through a number of periods. And so it is helpful to inform visitors of all of the aspects of the house's history. So now I move on to the major object of my presentation, the Clifton Heritage National Park. The Clifton Heritage National Park is at the western tip of New Providence Island. In the slide, the area just at the end. This area in the 1990s, this area of land was up for a proposed development. And if the development had gone ahead, public access to the beautiful beaches, the one site on New Providence Island where persons are able to fish from the cliffs on the island, and the cultural heritage, the remains of a Loyalist period plantation, all of these would no longer have had public access. Officials from an agency like the Antiquities Corporation would have some access, but no public access. And there was huge public protests, so much so that eventually the government of the Bahamas purchased the property and created the first National Heritage Park in the Bahamas. And the park opened to the public in 2009. So the focus of the park is the main house, the main Clifton house that is on the eastern side of the main street that passes through this property. We know from research that the house dates to the late 1700s, but the more longer standing, the more prominent owner of the property was a Loyalist named William Wiley. He only acquired the property in the early 1800s. And we interpreted that he built the slave village that's like a quarter of a mile away from the main house. These slave houses are the best surviving slave houses in the Bahamas because of the way they were built. Most slave houses in the Bahamas at this point only present as a heap of unbonded stones, rocks. But the construction technique that these houses are made from is known as a tabby construction technique that was introduced to the Bahamas by Loyalist planters coming in from the Carolinas and Georgia. Now, the technique was introduced by European descended residents, but the construction would have been done by their enslaved workers. And so the layout of these houses is very African. All of the houses, there are remains of 7, have basically the same size, but roughly similar layouts. There are 2 doors, front and back, that are opposite each other because most of the activity areas would have been out back, including their cooking kitchen areas. And within the house, it would have been divided in 4 areas. On this house that is in the foreground of this image here, on the window jamb, there is an etching, a graffito of a sloop. In my research on ship graffiti in the Bahamas has the largest percentage of these for all of the Caribbean. In the Bahamas, these are heavily associated with African descended people, not completely associated. And it's probably because it was a graphic form of representing these types of ships. They didn't have to write it, they drew it. But since that, in the last hurricane, there has been some damage, and that part of the wall collapsed. About 3 years ago, the layout of these houses were used to assist the Coconut Grove community, the historic Coconut Grove community in South Florida. That community in the late 1800s and early 1900s was established by Black Bahamian immigrants moving over to South Florida. And we learned that about 50 of these historic structures were up for possible demolition. And we quickly needed to establish their cultural connections with an African descended population from the Bahamas. And these houses at Clifton, the slave houses at Clifton, were used as the earliest examples to show the layout, the basic size layout of these houses. Even though later ones may have used wood as the building material, the basic layout of the houses remained the same. And so today, the focus at the Clifton Heritage National Park focuses on the daily activities of the African population at the Clifton Heritage Site. And I'm going to slow up there because I think I may be out of time. So,
yes, just a couple more minutes there.
Oh, great. A couple more minutes? Oh, cool, thank you. So the archaeology, when the proposed development was going on, the archaeology that was done focused more on the slave houses than on the main house. And that is when we more clearly understood the activity areas, and it continued, it fit with the cultural heritage that continued with the African descended population in the Bahamas later. But we also know from historical research that William Wiley was host to 4 liberated African apprentices beginning between 1811 and 1818. After the 1807 abolition of the Slave Trade Act by the British Parliament, the Bahamas became one of the primary locations on the western side of the Atlantic where Africans rescued from slave ships by the Royal Navy were resettled. And the first group arrived in 1811. Those people were portioned out to different planters and settlers, and 4 of them lived and worked with William Wiley on his plantation. We know from his records that they were all males. They all married enslaved women. And so they lived in these houses, and much of the very visible African-derived cultural presentation found in the archaeology is associated with this liberated African presence. One of the men, we presume, at least one of those men, we presume would have been a foot soldier in the 6th West India Regiment, because a 6th West India Regiment button was found. The West India regiments were created in the 1790s as particularly Black troops. The Bahamas had those troops from 1801 until the military pulled out of the Bahamas in 1890 because yellow fever took such a toll on European soldiers. The British military sent mostly Black soldiers to the Bahamas. And the one West India Regiment button that was found at one of the slave houses at Clifton Plantation. and so that helped us to understand that that liberated African element were also connected with the West India Regiment, and that from the documents you would never be able to make that connection. But it was a major part of developing the interpretation for these slave houses. So I will stop there again before I go over my time. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Turner. Reg, Dr. Murphy, do you want to start your presentation? Great. And
okay.
Great.
Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. When I first invited by Dr. Ennis to make a brief remarks of this, it's the topic I found rather interesting because it sort of sums up what archaeologists have been doing for a long time, particularly here in Antigua. We're trying to look beyond the obvious, beyond the house, because a house in this context is, what is a house? Is it a barracks? Is it a slave's house? Is it the owners of their plantation? They're all houses, and every house is built by someone, usually by the enslaved people. So there's such a cross mixture of material culture. That's who lived in the house at what time period. All of this changes. So it's a really complex question that I think archaeology has been doing a lot of good work in Antigua, sort of filtering through. As an island with close to 2,000 sites of archaeological interest, there's very, very little preservation, and there's very little legislation to support preservation. And as a result, it's our research strategy is to let's do the most endangered ones first, unfortunately. But that's the reality of the situation also in the region. Archaeology focuses on objects. And again, to me, it's a neutral way to sort of cut through the sort of the biases and the myths. Most of these sites have great myths, from the ghost stories right down to who lived there and what happened there. And so we're filtering through that. And the mythology is really popular, particularly with the taxi drivers. And that is a storyline that gets dragged along, not the real facts. So we have to look and focus on the facts and to present those facts for, within its real context. Now, I'm going to look at a couple of sites that we've been working on as case studies. And let's see if this works. Okay, next slide. Okay, excuse me here while I try and figure out, talk to my naughty computer. Oh, there we go. Okay, Betty's Hope. Now, very little is known about the physical site. The Codringtons owned Betty's Hope. He was the Governor General. He's been well known throughout Caribbean history for 3 generations, but they live primarily in England. But their estate in Antigua at any given time had over 300 resident enslaved people. There are only attorneys that manage this. So Antigua lacks the great sort of estate houses you see in places like Jamaica and Barbados. But these are, they're valid nonetheless. And to us is, we want to compare what's happening across the site and to discover the site, because we didn't know the Great House was still there, at least the foundations. So we focused on the windmill first, then the Great House, and then the enslaved village and the distillery and the sugar works. So we're looking at what happened here. But we're not just looking at, let's look at the grand old house. We're trying to figure out the daily life, the routine, the people who live there, because they're mostly enslaved people there. And we're looking to see who's eating what's the diet made of. We're looking at everything from we're finding eggs of exotic birds and bones from exotic birds like pheasants and things like that that does not live in the Caribbean. So, and we're finding remains of deer that they introduced to Barbuda. So we're finding exotic things, and when we look at the other areas, it's not quite so exotic. But the material culture is fuzzy because you're going to find the African style cooking pots outside of the Great House kitchen, as well as on the site of the enslaved. So it's a really fuzzy material culture. And as archaeologists, it presents some interesting challenges to us. Now, the windmill, we built this to working condition, finding parts all across the island. And it's archaeology by experiment. It was purely an experiment. We ran it exactly 13 times to make sure it ran, it works well. And then we mothballed it for safety. But we have to keep remembering, and the mill is a good example. All objects have a social context, a social connection. So to me, it's a beautiful piece of technology, turns 13 times of the wind vanes to make one turn of the roller. But who worked on those mills? Who built them? What were their lives like? Who made the profits from working this thing 24 hours a day, losing limbs if they get caught in the machinery? So you have to look at both things and interpret it both ways. And that will enrich the whole story and not just talk about the fancy great house or the beautiful technology of the windmill. So again, the social context to me is more relevant, more important, because that tells the real story of why the mill was even built in the first place. Now, we take it to a micro level. We also look at the soils. We look at every possible thing we can think of. Now who's we? For 25 years, 27 years now, we've been inviting graduate students, professors, and we've been running and hosting field schools in Antigua, sometimes 2 a year. And it depends on the focus of the university, the focus of the individual students, and our needs, because we host this thing and we want to make sure we're getting what we need out of it to create a win-win situation. And we work along with the students, and we encourage a wide multidisciplinary approach. We even look at the pollen to see the plants. We look at the phytoliths. We look at the, excuse me, we do residue analysis, anything possible thing to get information across the spectrum of the archaeology to understand what life was like and how that estate functioned. So in some places we find toxic waste that is amazing. It's almost off the scale because it's just this way they've been doing, treating cattle and animals and different things, and holding things like a lot of lead and mercury. So again, now in that same line, comparing the lifestyles of the elite and the enslaved, trying to get a cross section of the sites, we did the same thing at Shirleys Heights, which is really, sorry, he was the Governor General of Antigua, Governor Shirley, who built the military barracks during the time of the Napoleonic Wars. So we're looking at the barracks. Who lived in these barracks? We always assume the grand old fancy stone barracks were the residence for the elite troops from England, but we also find the West Indian regiments also occupied these. In fact, they're the ones that left graffiti behind as well. So it's interesting to see, and we're finding unique features on the landscape, like grinding holes, and I'll show you a few that they obviously used to prepare their foods. And it's so we're looking at who lived in these barracks. What is the social context like? We find every building there except the church and the bathhouse. So it's amazing the life at that time. So we get really fascinating insights into the daily life. This is one of the buildings. Now, our archaeology also aids in restoration, because when we want to rebuild these buildings, quite often we find it's not just one building, but where you think it's empty space, you may have about 4 or 5 buildings that are down to the foundation level. So we also look at the material culture that's coming up, like the type of nails, the type of size of timbers. We look for where the timbers were inserted in the structure. We look at the slate, the type, the color of the slate, the source of stone. We look at the stone, the type of stone, and we source it on island to see what's being imported, because everyone assumes everything is imported, but all of these were cut within a few meters of each site. So everything's important. So we look at everything from the complete spectrum. We also do a lot of forensic archaeology. We have to work on sites that are being developed. And when it turns out that there's a historical cemetery there, it's going to happen. So we get in there as quickly as we can. We pull together teams of students who want to learn forensics, and we bring them down, and we have field schools, and we get a whole lot of information. And these people are being kept for reburial at a grander location where it will not be disturbed. We do everything from, we do heavy metal testing to see why so many young people dying. It's all yellow fever, always yellow fever. But we're finding that every single one of these people suffer from lead poisoning as well, because they had so much lead in their diet on a daily basis. And thanks to work done on the synchrotron in the University of Saskatoon in Canada, we know they also have heavy doses of mercury in their bones, which is a treatment given for symptoms of things like yellow fever and lead poisoning. So we're learning a lot about the diet. We're now looking at strontium. We're looking at the DNA of these individuals to see, okay, who are all these people, where they come from. And the biggest surprise was these cemeteries are not segregated. You'll find them all put together sometimes in the same grave, mixed populations, white, black, and young males, very young males, even children, but no females in the cemetery, some strange reason. But it's interesting to see, you can tell the epidemics, because suddenly you'll see a grave filled with bodies or just hurriedly buried, as opposed to just the proper, quite often no coffins, just wrapped in a shroud or something. So we excavate these people, we do as much study as we can, and then we train a whole generation of new forensic anthropologists. And then before the site is built on, we remove them, we package them, put them away properly in the national parks storage area, temporarily pending reburial. So it's a very active project that's given us a lot of surprises. These are some of the grinding holes I'm telling you we find the West India Regiment. So I don't know if you've seen these in Bahamas, but it's really fascinating to find these holes, and they're quite common apparently in just sort of north of the Sahara, sort of sub-Sahara on the fringe, where you find the tree line sort of disappears. So you find these rocks adopted by families for generations, and they make these grinding holes and they process all of their food in them. Now, archaeology, again, we use it at the Great House. This is Clarence House just after the restoration. You can see it's a typical Palladian style villa, Caribbean, Georgian influences, built by enslaved Africans. And this was a complete ruin. So what we did was we got the older, the most serious experienced stonemasons, and we cut all of the stones for this from local material, and some 200 tons of it. And then we completely rebuilt it. A lot of the furniture was replicated from the damaged furniture. So it's a training process, young masons, old masons, furniture builders building traditional Caribbean furniture, patterns that haven't been built in generations. And now it's an up and running facility. But in the foundation works, we're looking at the archaeology because we're trying to solve the myth of it was a home of Prince William when he was here on HMS Pegasus. So what we found was this older section beneath the foundations of this one. And we found African pottery that identical to the type we're finding in Africa, in Ghana, Nigeria, places like that. And they're identical to the ones being made in Antigua, but they're coming from the foundations of this building, along with European China, which gives a good comparative date. So we learned a whole lot about this so it's a chance to show that archaeology, look at the social context. We're looking at restoration. We're looking at job creations. We're looking at training. So we have to look at the house as a whole. It's an opportunity. It's a chance for tourism. We bring the kids there. People make money. People, it creates a living, and that is one of the biggest benefits of doing this sort of work. And I think that if we did this approach to all older structures in the Caribbean, we would not see so many disappearing as they are right now. But what the message I'd like to leave behind is it's more than just a house. It's a place of, it's everyone. It's influenced by the entire population. The stone is harvested there by people who live there. It's brought together by the builders who live there. And whoever who lives in it, eventually they move on and somebody else will inherit it. So a house is a in transit kind of, I call it like a waiting room. And hidden histories. Another little surprise that came up, this is my last final word, promise, Tara, is one of my grad students who was here, who's now the director of heritage at the dockyard, he worked on the fortifications of Antigua. And to his surprise, an island that prides itself on having a fort every 2 miles, the most fearsome place no one ever wanted to invade, and no one ever did. But yet half the guns are pointing in the wrong directions. And when you look at who was there and when and how it happened, you realize it was actually manned by local guys with kids and all drawing a pay, but yet they were totally ineffective. Half of them couldn't work, and the guns were no good. And so we have to look at history 2 ways. You have to look at the physical remains and then compare it with the long-held beliefs and myths. And to me, archaeology and anthropology is a good way to filter through all of that and come to some sort of hopefully a realistic, viewpoint. So from that, I'll pass on to Angus.
Thanks, Reg. That was great. If you want to just stop sharing your screen so that,
yes.
so that can
That's
start. Thank you. I hope in the questions and comments you can share a little bit about the March 8th research that is ongoing, but we'll get to that. Angus, do you want to make a start?
Sure. Okay, thank you, everyone. I guess my two presentations are going to be, I guess, slightly different in terms of the houses that I'll be looking at. And I just want to start off by talking about the idea of hidden houses. I would say hidden in plain sight, because the images of the historical Grenadian landscape are everywhere. Grenadians see them every day, but they remain hidden. I think they hidden because there is no context, no stories, no interpretation. There's nothing that informs Grenadians of that history. I think I think our historical Grenadian landscape can be as foreign to Grenadians as it is to visitors, because we know it teaches very little of that history. When we do, it is sometimes incorrect, as Reg talked about, when we find locals taking people around, visitors around. And sometimes it is sanitized because our public history is a tourism product, and it's often written from the perspective of the tourism authority. I think the bottom pictures show our National Library and Archives, which has been closed since 2011, and some of the our documents that are stored in these places. The second two images are of documents in our registrar's office, and the last two images are the boxes of revolution documents that were taken by the US, and they were demanded by many people, and they were just thrown in one of the old forts, and they have been infected by termites. The problem with not having adequate archives and with allowing tourism to determine the public history, we end up with monuments and other things that are either very inappropriate. This is a monument to the Kalinago at Leapers Hill. It's biased with the information on it, and the information is also incorrect, sorry. Then we have other places where, because on plantations, there's very little presence of slavery. We find people finding things, that presence. And in Grenada, we've come up with these slave pens, which these are structures that were associated with the kitchen. And some of them actually, one of them actually looks a lot like an ice house, and they may have been used for ice house to store ice in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So those are two of the issues that we have when we don't have the necessary resources and allow the people to do the research. But despite all of this, the hidden is gradually becoming known. And two of the projects I'm going to look at, the first one is about the indigenous archaeology of indigenous peoples. And it's called Changing the Narrative. Indigenous heritage in Grenada has about 3 or 4 basic narratives. The first indigenous people in Grenada were the Siboney. The Arawaks from South America settled Grenada after them. The Caribs invaded and drove out the Arawaks, and the extinction of the Caribs at Leapers Hill caused by the French. Those are basically the most that you would hear people talk about when they talk about indigenous heritage. There really is not much details, even of the historical era. In 2016 and 2017, a group of researchers and students from Leiden University in Grenada under Dr. Corinne Hoffman and Menno Hoagland began archaeological excavations at a coastal site in the village of La Poterie, St. Andrew. The project engaged a community on multiple levels, with local students as volunteers and several community members hired to assist the dig. At the end of excavation, the team had found evidence that the site at La Poterie was in fact a 16th century indigenous site and a contact site because of the presence of European artifacts and probably one of the last free Kalinago villages. There was the archaeological excavation of La Poterie was the largest undertaken in Grenada in the last 30 years. Unlike Reg in Antigua, we have very little archaeology going on in Grenada. We have had almost zero historical archaeology. The majority of the archaeology projects in Grenada have been pre-colonial. The Community Archaeology Project at La Poterie received a great deal of coverage in the national press and on television, creating a buzz in the community and across the island. The 2 short seasons of community archaeology excavations at La Poterie St. Andrew were able to create awareness of Grenada's heritage, particularly its indigenous heritage, and showed it in a new light. It also created interest in both the indigenous and colonial landscape. Now, when issues concerning indigenous Amerindian heritage comes up, we now have a new narrative that can be added. As a result, there are efforts by individuals and groups to promote, educate on Amerindian heritage. Later this month, there will be an online event to commemorate the massacre that took place at Leapers Hill in 1650, which will be an online presentation. And a number of groups and individuals are actually promoting indigenous heritage, even though we do not have a resident indigenous descendant population in Grenada. The second study I'll talk about is totally takes you out of the house into the yard. It's called the Timmy Nation of Carriacou, connecting Sierra Leone and Carriacou after almost 200 years. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Sierra Leone, and I lived among the Timne people in central Sierra Leone. And once I started studying Grenada's history, I recognized that there must be a connection between the Timmy Nation of the big drum dance in Carriacou and the Timnees that I live among. So one of the things that I did was consult Joe Pala, who had studied Sierra Leone history and had made connections between the Gullah in South Carolina and Georgia to Sierra Leone. So we started talking, and I started doing some of the research. We eventually brought on Dr. Cynthia Schmidt, an ethnomusicologist. Spent about a year exploring these connections through slave voyage database, historical records, old newspapers, etc., until we were able to draw some conclusions. We realized that the reason for the survival of such a small group from West Africa on such a tiny island in the Caribbean had to do with the Scots, because the Scots end up owning quite a few plantations on Carriacou, cotton plantations mostly. And one of them was owned by a gentleman called John Mill. He was in partnership with Richard Oswald and Grant in controlling the slave island of Banks or Bunce Island in Sierra Leone. And they were sending enslaved people directly to Grenada and to these plantations in Carriacou. So we end up with a survival of this small ethnic group in Sierra Leone surviving in Carriacou into the 20th century, 21st century. With the historical connections made, we decided that it was time to go to Carriacou and share what we had found, and to also learn more about the current practice of the African Nation dance. We worked with a big drum dance group headed by Winston Fleury, and we recorded the specific Timne dances and songs that were practiced in the big drum dance. The hope was to send it to Sierra Leone to see if there was some similar dances and styles in Sierra Leone. We did not really find anything, but people recognized elements of it. We engaged the community members to learn about Sierra Leone's unique African ancestral practices, to understand the context for historical connections. For the first time, Grenada was able to make a direct connection to West Africa. We had found out how a small group of people on the tiny Caribbean island of Carriacou, who today call themselves Timne, were directly descended from the Timne Nation of Sierra Leone via slavery and the slave depot at Bunce Island. The Carriacou community was very excited to explore this connection further. So it was decided that we should engage the people of Sierra Leone and see how this connection could be celebrated. Amadou Massaly, a Sierra Leonean cultural activist living in the US, picked up the baton and ran with it. After what seemed like an eternity, we had finally organized a Timney reunion to celebrate the reunion of Timneys in September of 2016, after almost 200 years of separation. Sierra Leone sent 3 prominent people to represent them. Isatu Smith, she was the chairperson of the Monuments and Relics Commission, Paramount Chief Baibure of the Port Loko district in Sierra Leone, and the Minister of Tourism. The entire Carriacou community came out to participate in this unique celebration. And it was really, we combined a lot of Carriacou culture with this celebration. One of them being the saraka that's still practiced on Carriacou. And the bottom left image is actually Senator Hood stirring cuckoo as part of the saraka that would take place. There's Paramount Chief Baibure getting ready to do the libations on one of the plantations, the one that was owned by John Mill. And this is a Grand Bay plantation on the eastern coast of Carriacou. And the top pictures of everybody who came out to see, all the Carriacou people who came out to see and experience this event. It was a 2-day event. This was probably one of the most fulfilling projects to work on because of the impact historical research had on so many people, confirming their beliefs in their ancestry and allowing them to celebrate it in such a way. I'm currently working with Broadsworth Hall on the legacy of Peter Tulliuson's slavery connections to Grenada, and exploring how to connect to the community in Grand Bacolet, Grenada, to tell a more complete story. He had owned a plantation in Grand Bacolet area. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Angus. That was great. I think we've had a good representation of all of the different types of projects, the kind of community encounters, the potential for more community encounters that we can have with the kind of research that is being done. We see that there's more research that needs to be done, but also the ability to translate that research into interpretation, especially for local communities, but also for our visitors who come to the region. I think we also noted that there's a fairly weak legislative or protective basis across the region as well. And that prevents us potentially from telling these stories, because if we don't have the heritage on the landscape, it becomes very, very difficult to share this kind of heritage and this kind of interpretation with communities as well. If it's okay, Elizabeth, shall I move right to question and answer? We have, I think, about 48 minutes, 38 minutes?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, people do keep it coming in as well, questions in
Sure. Okay. I think I'm going to start with this one because I think Grace wasn't able to tell us all about the interpretation that you have at installed at the houses, and I think this must have been at Clifton, at the Clifton Heritage Park. So if you could just share a little bit, Grace, about the kind of interpretation that is on site.
At the Clifton Heritage Park, yes. So the interpretation, there is a bit about the plantation owner, William Wiley. He was a prominent loyalist at his time. He left the Bahamas in the early 1820s. He left the Bahamas and went to St. Vincent. And we know that his overseer at the plantation, when he operated the plantation, his overseer was a free man of color. We're not quite certain if he came in with the loyalists or he had already lived in Nassau, but we know from research that he purchased most of the slaves who stayed on at Clifton. A lot of the ongoing research is continuing to interpret the archaeology around the slave houses. We know from documentation that Mr. Wiley, he was a benevolent owner. He wasn't an abolitionist, but he fell into that Enlightenment period, and also with the impact of the abolitionist movement in Great Britain, that you needed to treat your enslaved people better. And so the houses were fairly well built. There was legislation requiring owners to provide a certain amount of food for their enslaved people. But we know that at Clifton, Mr. Wiley allowed his enslaved persons to use the plantation vessel to sail from Clifton down to Nassau and sell any excess produce they would have. And so they were able to have some money, but that didn't mean that everything was so good for them, because we do know that he had one full family that ran away from Clifton. They were captured, and once they were captured, they were separated. But with the West India Regiment soldiers, William Wiley at one point was embroiled in a huge dispute with the House of Assembly. And this incident shows you how in the written documentation, just which words are used, which terms are used, can totally revise what that interpretation is. It was written in the House of Assembly records that William Wiley was arming his slaves. But once we found the West India Regiment button, it wasn't that he was arming slaves. One of the liberated Africans who lived at Clifton was a legitimate soldier in the West India Regiment, and he evidently put that individual to stand at the gate when the Assembly's bailiff came. And so he took these wild stories back to Nassau that Mr. Wiley was arming his slaves and preparing for insurrection, but the archaeology shows a very different story. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. If we could just move to some questions that have come in around, let me just pull this one down, I found it, about the fact that a lot of the heritage remains unprotected and at risk. So I was wondering if maybe we could hear from maybe Angus first, then Reg, maybe Grace can speak a little bit too on this. What is the context for protection of heritage in the various territories in which you work?
Right.
Angus.
I think for me, working now in the Dutch Caribbean on Saba, which is part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, it's a very different story. We actually just did an archaeological mitigation project because they're building a new port on the island. And in order for them to get the permits, they have to do an archaeological dig. We had to actually, we did done during the pandemic. So it was a really difficult project that we had to work on. And the whole community aspect of it we wanted to do, we couldn't do. But the fact that the permitting part of the project could not move on because they needed the sign off from the archaeologists. It's just a very different way of doing compared to, for example, Grenada, where we have issues going on right now, where we have these massive hotel projects going on and the destruction of natural and historical places. We actually were able, a friend, Dr. Jonathan Hanna, who is now in charge of the museum in Grenada, he was able to get resources to go do a dig at one of the hotel projects after the community made a big protest, about it. So we definitely lack the legislation, even though we were able to get legislation that's associated with establishing the museum as a government institution passed recently. And there's some protection for artifacts and things like that. There really is no implementation of that legislation to really protect these sites, because there seemed to be a big push by the government, to build these massive hotel projects, and the government is allowing, I guess, these projects to move forward without the adequate permission, to the adequate processing of these sites to make sure that they are mitigated in terms of historical and other avenues. So it is a big problem working in some of these different places where we do not have the necessary legislation or enforcement of legislation, as opposed to working on a place like tiny Saba, where we have to do this mitigation, and it is such a delight to be working in an environment like this.
Thanks. Reg, do you want to say something?
Well, in Antigua, it's quite a lot like Grenada in some parts. Within the national parks, the protected national parks with the World Heritage Site, they have very, very strong legislation. You can't even touch a site without permission. You can't even clear the land nowadays without permission. But the rest of the island, it's really spotty. Depends on how monumental like a windmill, is obviously in the landscape. Those fall under the sort of the preview of the Public Works Department. Should they be restored or not? But they're not managed. They're left up to the owners to manage them of the land. So if it falls in somebody who wants to tear his mill down, there's always a bit of a public outcry, and it stalls for a little bit, but eventually it probably happens. But they're so-called protected. It's not written in writing, except within the DCA Act, there are a few small lines that mention things. And we do have an inventory of historical and heritage sites, and the development control does have some authority to dictate what you're going to do with that site. But it's not strong enough. It's not specific enough. We have a draft bill that's been sitting there for like 5 or 6 years, and it's going to be needed for the UNESCO World Heritage to strengthen that legislation. But it has not gone through yet because of the issues. A good example that comes out of this is public opinion. As you mentioned earlier, that 8th of March project, that happened in 8th of March to September 1744, where 8 slaves were killed in construction work during the dockyard. They're blown up in the quarry, literally, by the mining stone. We made we went public with it, and it went out there, and everyone loved it, and it became a focal point. It's not just talking about the big frigates that came and went and Nelson and his thing. It's about the locals. And we looked up the names in the records, and they're names that reflect people in the community today. Some of those names are still there. So we started looking at that, and then we looked beyond that to find out, well, where are these skills people living? And we find out they're living on the hills beyond the dockyard. And lo and behold, there's the first village of enslaved people who lived there within the protection of the military. They were paid. They were treated, well, I guess anyone else would in the military compounds, but they could escape from the plantation and find refuge if they were skilled enough. And we have records of some of the planter in the House of Assembly threatening he's going to hang the first captain he sees who's hiding slaves like this or taking them on a ship. So it creates a whole new area to look into, and another whole social context. That area is also under pressure for development. So it's interesting to see what's going to happen in the end, but it's all of these little hidden histories that's just popping up when you start to do the research goes a long way, and especially if you get community support behind you to saving some of these sites.
Thanks, Reg. I know that I think I want to just prompt you a little bit further, and especially Grace could come in as well. The impact of natural disaster, and particularly hurricanes, on heritage, and that creating a real element of risk to the protection of heritage. I know that Barbuda, for example, was subject to almost complete destruction with the passing of hurricane. I think that was that Maria was that Maria for Barbuda?
They had Maria, I think.
Yeah, Maria.
It was Irma.
Irma, and then Dorian, and these are 2 Category 5 hurricanes that happened within a couple of years of one another, but in different parts of the Caribbean, but completely destroyed some of the islands, populations, etc., but also the heritage of those spaces as well. So if you could comment a little bit about that. Not too long, but if you and Grace could come in to speak a little bit about the experience in the Bahamas as well.
Okay. One of the things we're doing right now is a project looking at coastal sites in particular and heritage sites to see how they're going to survive in the predicted new hurricane strength that's coming up these days, and how they're going to survive sea level rise, storm surges. We're looking at the dockyard at the World Heritage Site. That's only about 50 centimeters above sea level. And part of it floods with high, when you have these king tides, these super high tides, and the whole place, the highest point within the compound is less than a meter. So it's interesting to map these sites now, so we can do predictive modeling to find out what's going to happen, what could happen, what will be lost first, so we can have priorities in the future. And we're doing all of the coastal sites, and we have some more surprise. We go to some sites where we did archaeology 15, 20, 25 years ago, and they're gone. And even the entire site is gone. Our units are now out in the ocean somewhere. So these things are moving. It's happening very fast, faster than we think. So it's interesting to see. Well, but at the end of it, we'll have a good, hopefully a good study of where we're going to go in the future, and to guide legislation and hopefully guide development. But most of Barbuda, 90% of Barbuda is less than 10 feet in height, about 2 meters in height. And there are people rushing to build on the beaches that are 50 centimeters above height. So it's interesting again there. But however, what we've done is we've now joined forces, and we're going to be doing work with Puerto Ricans, and so we can compare notes, and hopefully we can make this a regional research to come up with the same method, the same sort of standards of notes and information and data collecting. And then we can come up with a broader Caribbean. But again, this is day one, page one of this project. And but it looks really promising. And now the thing that survived in Barbuda, most of all, when you go now there to do the post-disaster needs assessment with UNESCO, all the new buildings were trashed. All the buildings with no reinforcing, but the way they were built, they survived. The Martello Tower is standing there, proud, not a scratch. But the newer buildings, especially the big ones like the churches, they all took the brunt of the hurricane. And when they have containers flying around, I guess it makes it difficult to stand up against it. But so we're going to look at these older buildings and see, well, why are they so unique? Why are they so different? I want to do some architectural drawings and look at the shape. Are they, what's unique about them? Why do they survive? And they're like 150 years old, made of stones and no reinforcing. What's holding on that tiny little hip roof? So it's interesting data coming out soon.
Great. We look forward to that. Grace, did you want to just speak to some of those issues?
Okay, yeah. So for the Bahamas, we do have cultural heritage protection legislation that took 20 years before it was passed. And the Clifton project, the protest against that proposed development, was one of the motivating factors to help finally push that legislation forward. In the Bahamas, especially because of that legislation, but even before that, any development that comes up, if it's known that the development is going to be in an archaeologically sensitive area, whether it's pre-Columbian or in the later historic period, the developers are required to pay for the archaeological mitigation of that. And the archaeologists submit a report with their recommendations. It's unusual for us to be able to hold on to any Lucayan sites because they have no visible above ground structures remaining. But for historic period sites, we usually put in stipulations that any of those structures, even though they may be the dry stone walls that divided areas of plantations, they be as much as possible retained. Sometimes we don't win out so well, but we're working on it. Now, that is mostly New Providence. When you get to the other islands outside of New Providence, it is a much bigger challenge. Again, developments going into areas with known archaeological resources are required to have the archaeological mitigation. And because of big projects like Clifton, because also the communities are now becoming aware of the value to them of their cultural heritage as well as their commercial value, the communities become more vigilant, and sometimes the communities come out and protest. But that being said, we found that it is also helpful to educate and inform the Department of Customs and the Department of Immigration. Because for the ship graffiti, that was one of my initial studies looking at that throughout the Bahamas. The examples are not on every island, but they are far more common in the Bahamas than anywhere else in the Caribbean. On one particular island, and because of the historic element, they are found mainly on buildings, but sometimes on rock walls in caves. But on one island, I had done a presentation on that. Someone went and tried to chip off the plaster. The largest, most beautiful example of a ship drawing at that plantation site was destroyed. And so for the Bahamas, for the other islands, we have found that in a way, the best protection for them has been to keep them fairly isolated and far away from the public, because these are sites that are close to 200 years old. The modern roads don't go past them. They're overgrown in weeds and bushes. We don't encourage them being cleared too often because we don't as yet have the staff capacity to adequately monitor those sites. And another element, on some of our islands, one in particular, Crooked Island, there is an African-derived cultural heritage of leaving personal objects on top of a grave. An eating vessel, a drinking container, and sometimes an eating utensil. And on Crooked Island, they are on the deepest water passage passing through the Bahamas. They retained that cultural heritage longer than even the New Providence. That cultural tradition did not start disappearing until the early 2000s. I went there and was documenting that and was explaining to a friend, she's Canadian, but she and her family lived there year round. She told one of her neighbors about it. When I was on my way to the airport, I ran into these people. They had gone into a cemetery, and we were using that as a means of dating these cemeteries where you don't always find surviving grave markers that are legible. They went and took every dish, every container, except one dish that was far at the back of the cemetery and overturned, because these are documented mid-1800s original ceramics. The average Bahamian, white or black, would not touch any cultural object coming out of a cemetery, but a visitor doesn't have that cultural connection. And so for those kinds of issues, we still have a huge challenge in our other islands in protecting the movable cultural heritage, especially. And for hurricanes, not so much the built heritage, because as Reg pointed out, especially those tabby constructed buildings, unless you take a wrecking ball to them or have a tree grow out of them, they can withstand any hurricane, especially if there are trees surrounding them. The Clifton site was exposed in Hurricane Matthew in 2016 because Hurricane Matthew approached New Providence from the southwest. That's an unusual route. And the managing director at the time had cleared far too much vegetation on the coastline. So the main house went through some more demolition after the fire it had experienced 150 years earlier, but a wooden fence that the managing director had inadvertently put up was flipped over the chain link fence, and it smashed 2 of the 7 slave houses. So that was an unusual incident for historic sites, but for Lucayan sites, sometimes we find new sites because the beaches are heavily eroded during hurricane or heavy storm events like that. Yeah.
Thanks, Grace. I think some of your comments, I think, speak to the issues of not only poor heritage management, but just heritage legislation, but also the management practices. So there's not perhaps as much management as we would like to see in the Caribbean, and the ability to communicate those management issues to communities as well. So that becomes a major challenge. I think somebody else here has picked up an issue related to heritage management that is a continuous challenge across the region. And if you could just comment briefly, I think, Reg, you've probably had the best experience out of, I think, all of the presenters in terms of fundraising strategies and the challenge of financing heritage preservation at these sites. If you could speak just a little bit about that experience in terms of, and also the kind of economic focus of heritage management in Antigua. A couple of questions have asked about that.
Okay, well, I've been involved in trying to get money to start the museums I've been working on, and Betty's Hope and all this since in mid-80s. Getting money to pay for sites or to restore, people don't share the same vision we do. And for them to give up hard-earned money is hard unless they get something for it. So what we found by using the American system, the tax system, the 503C, something is called, or getting registered with the charity commissions in Great Britain, there's very little ways of getting serious money, but then you have to find the donors. But if you have your mechanisms in place so they can get tax relief from these donations, then that should be successful. That's what we did with Clarence House and with Betty's Hope. But generally, you're going to be getting nickel and dimes. You'll be selling cakes and having parties forever, trying to raise money. What we're trying to look at now is turning this thing around. The NGOs, we're always going cap in hand. What if we can contribute? So we're trying to say, okay, to the developers, look, we want to set up this. It's to your benefit to have a proper museum, or to your benefit to have a proper infrastructure or something like that. Where you can take your guests to at the hotel. Why not contribute to fixing up the site so you have somewhere to go to? Help us to improve ourselves, and then that way we're helping you. And also, so we have to sell the value, the economic value of heritage and heritage sites. People only see money, and the politicians only see 5 years of money, and that's it. So to get them to get involved when they can flip that piece of land quite easily to a developer, they're going to make that choice all the time. So you have to prove, why is that site of value? Why is that site worth it? And again, the best support you have is social media. You have to get the public on your side. You have to make the locals want it. If the community doesn't want it, it's not going to happen. But if there's enough outcry, and if there's enough support, and especially go international, let the world know, then people will pay attention, because they want the vote, and they want the, and you'll hope, and hopefully they'll get a good site out of it. And that's the best thing to do. So we've tried to support everything. Now, for management of sites, there's very little competent authorities locally to complain to. That is the biggest issue. Sites are being destroyed, sites are being, they call me 24 hours a day, and I have no sort of physical authority anymore. No, I'm no longer within the national park system. So there's no one to complain to when somebody's tearing down a windmill or stealing stones from an old building. And these are the things that happen. So you need to get, so again, it's a public outreach, it's getting the public on your site to be their eyes and ears. It's a lot of schmoozing, a lot of hanging out with people to tell them, look, if you see anyone come by here with 2 gravestones in the back of the truck, that's a problem.
Oh, all right. Yes, just sort of, we've now all got to do research.
Okay, thanks for that help. But it's a matter of getting the community on board. Social media nowadays is a fantastic platform, and you need to have your eyes and ears and the support. But you have to be prepared if you do get a big donor. So look at the bigger picture, getting yourselves registered as NGOs, getting yourself legally set up, good track record, good financial situations. That's the best advice I can give.
Great, thanks for that, Reg. Let me just check to see what other questions we have here. A lot of questions around heritage protection, and I think that it is a big challenge in the Caribbean. I think, Angus, this would be just a question that I want to kind of pull out of some of the things that you were saying, Reg, but Angus, you would have some perspectives on this as well, especially given some of the current research that you're doing. How much of a connection can be made between, a tangible connection can be made between sites in the Caribbean and sites in the United Kingdom and Europe and elsewhere. So what would you like to see from these kinds of connections that could be made? Is there possibilities for collaboration? So if we look at a site in England, somewhere in the countryside, somewhere that had an associated economic presence in the Caribbean, a site of exploitation, what is the relationship that you would like to see built between these two sites?
I think we're just beginning to see, we're always aware that, one of the places I actually visited was Paxton House in Scotland, that was owned by Ninian Home, who was a governor, lieutenant governor of Grenada during Fedon's rebellion. He was actually executed by the rebels during the rebellion. So it was interesting to go and visit that house. And I was very welcome. And I think there's an openness to want to make connections because they realize that not connecting to places in the Caribbean is not telling the full story. And I think we see that with some of the stuff that's going on at some of the other English heritage houses, like Broadsworth and stuff, Hall. But I think, and we are talking about ways to make this connection to the people especially in the areas where these plantations were. And trying to figure out ways in how we can cooperate. What are some of the things? One of the big things that we lack in the Caribbean is resources, financial resources and management and things like that. So it's ways of, for example, we would probably want to do an exhibition because we don't know anything about what went on in the UK in these communities. Whereas they might know about these communities from plantation records and things like that. On the other hand, the communities know very little. They know things that may have been left, in oral history and things like that. But I think it would be good for them to get a sense of what it is that's out there, what it is was built, what is Paxton House like? They have a massive collection of paintings, that would have been, much of it would have been bought at some period on the labor of these people on these plantations. So I think it would be really helpful if we can get these connections going. And I think working with Broadsworth Hall would be a good way for us to come up with a model as how we interact. Both these communities interact, try to help each other with the stories of the other end, and how we can learn more, and how these communities can benefit these communities in the Caribbean can actually benefit from that relationship. So.
Thanks. I don't know if Reg or Grace wanted to kind of come in on that question, but one of the things that also has come up, and I think this is something that I think we saw in all of your presentations, the kind of reliance on foreign expertise or outside expertise, overseas expertise in kinds of shoring up what is available on various territories. So in the examples that Reg, Dr. Murphy was able to share with us, for example, a lot of that work is coming out of field schools, archaeological field schools that are really driven by outside of the Caribbean universities. What do you think about this particular connection? And is this something that can be changed if we have more local resources available and people who are interested in doing this kind of research? Is the representation, is the reinterpretation going to change if we're able to kind of attract more local people to heritage management, I guess? Reg, maybe you might have a
yes, thank you. One of the things that came to mind as you were talking was the connections. We're in a new era now, and you have, for example, Royal's Estate in Antigua. The funding from that, from Isaac Royal, started Harvard Law School, and there are so many examples of all of these across. Why not? I think these people are now, universities are now institutions. They're now more open to negotiating and talking because they want to tidy up their history too. And so I think the time is now to make connections, and we can take restoration and preservation and to a whole new level. And I think, that was a good opportunity we have to grab because it's not going to come around too often. The field schools, as a youngster, I used to go and tag along with my predecessor, Desmond Nicholson, to field schools run by students, professors, watch them pack up all the stuff, date it, off they go with it. Never hear from them again. So when I figured out, I'd love to do archaeology. So I went back to university again and retrained and did archaeology. And now what we do is we create a win-win situation. We're sort of taking control of what happens and where the focus is and how it's done. And we come up with projects, we come up with sites, we find a way to assist them. They take the stuff back only because they want to study it. They don't have the time to do it fully here. So we create a facility for storage, a place to work, a place where a central place where they know they can leave their notes and everything is going to be there when they come back. So we create that situation for them. We get the data, we get the artifacts, we manage everything. They get their degrees and off they go, and they still come back year after year bringing new students. So we've gone from one university, which is Trent University, to dozens. And in fact, last year, Harvard was supposed to have come and join us, and a couple of other people from different other universities were interested. So it is actually growing and growing for 25, 27 years. And we have seen about 25 or 26 PhDs and masters come out of this simple little program that we've been offering here. Because the best of the students will take an opportunity, take a theme, and they run with it. Like all that data with the pollen and the phytoliths and the eggs, that's, those are done not by me. I understand how it's done because I have to work with these students, but they produce the high quality research and the data out of it. So they get that opportunity and we get the data and we get our material culture and we learn. So it's a win-win situation. And to me, that's the way it should be. When students coming from overseas, archaeologists come from overseas, they'll talk to a government official to get permission, who may not be qualified to make that decision. Is this guy going to do a good job? Is he actually doing something proper? What's going to happen when he leaves? The museum is going to get, if he does leave the stuff behind, the museum is going to get a pile of stuff. Nobody knows what it is or how to deal with it. And right now, even our place storage, filled to the ceiling. We don't know what is bursting at the seams. So we have a collections management issue. So again, all of this now has to be rethought of, and we need more facilities. We need bigger facilities. We have the opportunity now to get proper trained curators, collection managers, and take it again to a new level. There's so much that can be learned. There's so much that can be done, and so many opportunities that I think, and these islands with, here we're not taking, we have over 1,000 archaeological sites, and we produced 2 archaeologists, local archaeologists so far. And we have one who's moved here, Chris, who's resettled to Antigua. So we're slowly, but still, that's just a scratch. And when I go to the Development Control Authority and tell them, why don't you have an archaeologist working here? You're approving buildings or looking at the site. Same thing at lands and survey. You're plowing up fields and there's an archaeological site here. Why don't you have someone look at this first? So the job opportunities are there, but they don't think of it because they just don't know. And so we have to make them aware. So it falls on us now to be, in fact, I'm right now trying to put together a database, and they've been given it before, of the locations of sites with GPS coordinates. They lose it because they don't quite understand it, and we have to work with them. So it's a constant process of learning, upgrading, and keeping after them, because the heritage sites are being lost at a tremendous rate, both from development and especially the subsurface sites, like the pre-Columbian sites. So this is this thing that's happening. This is a reality we have to face out here in a country where there's so few regulations, so few rules. So the management of sites, we need a competent authority to go and check on sites, to do site inventories, and to just to do that, just to be monitors of sites. They must have some sort of a backing or legislative backing, almost like a tickets or someone who has authority to go and say, stop, you can't touch that, it's an old building. This is the reason why, other than me going into private property to try and tell people what to do with their buildings. So again, so there's that, it's a catch-22. So you gotta be popular, otherwise you're not gonna get it done.
Thanks, Dr. Murphy. I know that I think we are supposed to finish by 12:30, and I would like to just end, I think what you all have shared with us, I think, and particularly with a global audience, are the unique challenges that we have in the Caribbean, not only in terms of communicating this history to local populations, but on top of that, the challenge of dealing with natural disasters and hazards in our environments, future hazards, ongoing hazards like climate change as well, but also the financial issues of managing heritage, and also just the lack of protection and legislation. And for me, when I hear about the consternation in the UK around representing this part of our heritage and what does it mean to give back to the Caribbean, I think in jurisdictions where some of these heritage practices are very, very well developed, this is a way to give back. This is a way to twin, to found a relationship with the Caribbean. Find the sites that are in the UK, Europe, North America, that have profited off of these sites of exploitation in the Caribbean. And perhaps there's now a way of providing that kind of technical support to shore up what is obviously missing in our own environments, and give back to local communities and create the economic incentives and economic opportunities for local populations to build and grow as part of heritage development. So I'm going to hand back over to Elizabeth, and to kind of move into our kind of wrapping up of today's session. But I do want to thank all of our presenters for sharing their experiences across the Caribbean. I hope we've given you a good kind of flavor of all that we have to offer in the Caribbean in terms of heritage. Elizabeth, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, just to second your thanks, Tara, really, there's been so much to take in from today's session. And so just a sincere thanks on behalf of all the conveners to Grace and Reg and Angus for taking the time for sharing those amazing insights. Somebody asked on the chat whether we'd be able to share speakers' contact details and so forth. But as I mentioned in the chat, we are working towards a knowledge exchange hub, which would be kind of a place where we can have a community and online forum. And also kind of share some of these connects as well. So I'm just going to hand over to Kate for an announcement about next seminar, and I'll put the link in the chat now.
Great, thanks so much, Elizabeth. And yeah, I just want to echo the thanks really for such a thought-provoking session. There's just so much now to kind of think with. It's taken us in different directions, which has just been brilliant to see.